Let's talk.
John Brown.
I just thought I'd get that because I was feeling somewhat in a medieval mood on a Monday. My next guest is Tim Hames. He's talking about measuring monarchy, the most overrated and underrated British kings and queens. Since 1066, there have been more than 40 kings and queens of Britain, give or take a Cromwell, and Scotland not included. A dazzling cast of characters, but how do we measure monarchs? Who are the great, who are the good, and who are the, frankly, ones that we don't even want to talk about? I'm delighted to say that joining me live on the line from somewhere which hopefully isn't the Tower is the author of Measuring Monarchy, Tim Hames. Tim, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good to have you with... Whereabouts on God's green earth are you this morning, Tim?
I am actually in Clacton-on-Sea right now, which means that Nigel Farage is my Member of Parliament, and some people might think being in the Tower of London would be better.
Now, I've got to be careful, because somebody already said that I've mentioned Nigel Farage once already, and I've been accused of having a sneer in my voice. So, therefore, I shall not sneer. As you can see, I'm grinning broadly. Right then, since 1066 and all that, over 40 kings and queens. What was the spark behind this book, Tim?
Well, appropriate enough for a book about history, it had a long history. I used to be a journalist. I used to be a comment editor and columnist at the Times newspaper. And in very late 2001, that slightly cold period between Christmas and New Year when there's relatively little news, the Today programme decided to run an opinion poll amongst its listeners as to who was the best ever king or queen of Britain.
Yeah.
And they had Alfred the Great, they had Henry VIII, they had Elizabeth I, they had Victoria, who actually won it, and they had the late Queen Elizabeth II. And the spark for this idea for them was it was running into Queen Elizabeth II's 50th anniversary in 2002, her Golden Jubilee.
Yeah.
So they held this poll. Victoria won it, although if they'd used a different electoral system, maybe she wouldn't have done. Who knows?
On penalties after extra time, perhaps?
Penalties after extra time, with a lot of really lousy penalties being taken. I thought this was quite interesting. But I kind of thought it created a small kerfuffle in that, for some reason, the Cromwell lobby were terribly cross that he wasn't included on this shortlist. Now, although I have plenty of time for the Lord Protector personally, but A, he wasn't a king, B, he didn't want to be king, and C, he persistently refused to be king. So why on earth his supporters should object to the fact that he was on this shortlist was a mystery to me. But what made me kind of really cross, or to be honest, in the Christmas New Year week, really desperate to find something to write about, was that there was no attempt at kind of metrics. How do you decide that X is better than Y or Y is better than Z in the Today programme thesis? I mean, in fairness to them, this is probably something dreamt up after the end of a rather robust Christmas lunch.
Indeed.
But nonetheless, there should be points of measurement. So I wrote that piece, a 1,000-word piece at Times, published on December the 28th, 2001, which argued that your competence in handling the public finances, foreign policy and diplomacy, and succession planning were sensible ways of measuring monarchs. And if you did that, all of the people they shortlist, with the possible exception of Alfred the Great, fell short in one means or another. And actually the best king of England was Henry VII on that.
Controversial choice there, Tim. I can hear people racking. You see, a couple of things spring to mind on this one for a start. That top five: Victoria, Elizabeth II, of course, Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, etc. I mean, they are all sort of shoo-ins, aren't they? If you said, name me some British kings and queens, they would be the top of the list. Alfred the Great. I mean, a lot of people perhaps maybe wouldn't have studied. Maybe they might have gone for Edward the Confessor. You would have thought at that particular point, because we get a bit sort of hazy. The majority of us after sort of before the Battle of Hastings. So.
Yeah, that's true, but can I point out that if succession planning is on the list, then Edward the Confessor certainly shouldn't be on there. I mean, what a mess he left behind in terms of clarity of succession. No issues of his own, no heirs directly, and an ambiguity as to whether his son-in-law or whether William the Conqueror was the actual anointed one. mean, I'm afraid, he falls straight over. That is blasting a penalty straight over the bar, if I may say so.
A la Beckham. Now, but here's the thing. Perhaps those kings and queens who should be atop of this are those who are the, and if we're going to keep the football parlance, that solid back four who quietly get on with the job, deflecting, if you like, perhaps sorting, into the midfield area and a bit of conquest here and there, maybe taking back Aquitaine, for example. But certainly not going, all guns blazing, a la Gascoigne, running down the whole pitch. I mean, you want the solid, dependable types.
Yeah, but they aren't the solid, dependable types. That's precisely the point of my book, is that I don't go through every king and queen,
right?
Because not every king and queen is, to my mind, inappropriately rated. So we all agree that King John wasn't up to much. There's no point. There's no point joining in the kicking on that part, because there's no great controversy there. And we all probably agree, insofar as we have an interest in this state of affairs, that Edward I was a pretty competent monarch. So again, there's no point in labouring on about precisely why he was a competent monarch. So what I'm interested in is people who are famous, but not actually, when you drill down according to sort of business school type metrics, that great. So what you just described as a solid back four, they're not a solid back four. I'm interested in people like William IV, Edward VII, Queen Anne, who were actually solid, dependable characters who did the job properly, but people just don't, they didn't reign for terribly long, and people just don't give them the same sort of aura as they should do, because we give enormous status in our historical discussion to Henry VIII, who was a psychopath who had lots of wives.
Yeah, absolutely. That's being taught on the thing of empire and whatever. And Richard I, for example, who spent very little time, and his succession planning wasn't exactly up to much either.
Absolutely. He's very high on my list of the overrated. I mean, he bankrupted the kingdom, not least by getting himself kidnapped. Yes. And having to have an enormous ransom in order to release him. He was never here. He was an absentee landlord. He wasn't very good when he was here. He put off getting married for 20 odd years. He was betrothed to a daughter of the King of France forever. So for so long that his own father had to take her in to his household and make a mistress of her and have 4 illegitimate children by her.
Yeah, but he did have very close relationships with the King of France for a while, and then he fell out spectacularly with him.
Yeah, it's probably fair to say that Richard I, to use an old-fashioned phrase, wasn't the marrying kind. But his mother ultimately insisted on it. She went all the way out to Cyprus in order to bash him into it. But there was more chance of you and I having a child than there was of Richard I and his queen.
Yes, allegedly. As they used to say, didn't it? He never married. Moving to the obituaries. Let's get the bad ones out of the way. Presumably Richard II, Edward II, there's something having a second in your name also puts you at the bottom. Yeah, well, again, but everyone agrees they're useless. I mean, if you actually get deposed, and in one case allegedly you have a red-hot poker as your means of demise, the question of overrated versus underrated doesn't really enter the equation. So they're safely in the we know that they were lousy box. So you got 15 in there, right? So who are the ones that might sort of raise an eyebrow? Because we get through, I mean, I suppose the thing is, to most sort of casual historians, after sort of the madness of King George, because everybody saw the movie about 30 years ago now, do we sort of hit a grey area when it comes to Regency and it's all Jane Austen novels and we don't really know who's on the good thing is there are no sort of spectacular monarchs that we can get involved in, so therefore they're a safe pen to hands? George III, unfortunately, became mad. Yeah.
He's neither overrated nor underrated. We all know he's mad.
Yeah.
George IV was spectacularly unpopular.
Yeah.
Spectacular, beyond the Richter scale of unpopularity. But his brother, William IV, on the other hand, who never expected to become king, because George was ahead of him. George had a daughter, Charlotte, who died in outrageous circumstances of medical neglect in 1817. And there was an older brother, Frederick. So William doesn't become the heir apparent until 1827, when he's well into his 50s. And so he knows he's going to have a relatively short period of time as king. Yeah. And he's really rather good at it. He actually invented de facto the concept of the royal walkabout. I mean, he would just go out and talk to people, normal people, completely unlike his brother. So he deserves a sort of pat on the back, not only for being a different sort of monarch than the rest of the Hanoverians, who frankly there's not a lot to be said for Georges 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we know that they were only there because William, Duke of Gloucester, died in 1700, and James the Old Pretender, ridiculously refused to engage in a token conversion to Protestantism in order to take up his legitimate blood right to be king.
What about the Stuarts? Did they get a look in? Because we're talking about. I mean, I know we're keeping the Scots out of this, but I think. I mean, the two things I neglected the Plantagenets for far too long, and they were very angry with me. I can tell you, Henry II was not pleased. But
a good king, by the way. Yeah.
I was about to say that because I hadn't looked at them, and then I did a deep dive on the back of a few interviews I've done, and I was totally amazed by because I thought I just lost that period of history, and I'm just an amazing because I had that idea of Richard of Lionheart, Crusades, Bad King John, and that's kind of it. And then you see Henry II. Unfortunately for him, you get the White Ship disaster and the other sons dying off as well.
That's Henry the First.
First, sorry, yeah.
White Ship, 1120, death of Prince William. Yeah. Great constitutional crisis, Matilda or Stephen thereafter. Yeah,
yeah, and the anarchy and all that. Yeah,
which was a term the Victorian historians invented. It wasn't remotely seen as anarchic at the time. It was just another duff up amongst royals.
Yeah, the Stuarts then. Did the Stuarts get a look in?
Yeah, but I knew she did because again, I think James the First is sort of, people got more or less got him in a box, right? And no great argument about that. People will forever argue about Charles I, so I just park him. The ones I'm interested in as overrated, if you count him as a Stuart, which you probably shouldn't, William of Orange is overrated. And the one I think is massively underrated is poor old Queen Anne.
Because of bringing the union together, or what's the...
Well, the reason why she's has a sort of slightly dodgy public image is she was a very unwell woman all her life, and that was one of the reasons which motivated the Act of Settlement, was that nobody actually thought she lived to the age of 49, which she did do. She was very unwell. She was physically quite bluntly grotesque. That wasn't really her fault, because she was extremely unwell. And she had, we used to think it was 17 failed pregnancies. So the number somehow gone up to 19. God knows where he found the other two from. But anyway, and she fell out with her best mate, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, who then wrote vituperative diaries attacking her and implying that she might be a lesbian on the side.
Well, if you've seen the film The Favourite, you know exactly from whence this comes, yeah.
So you've got this whole wall of negativity. But she was the great passionate advocate for the Act of Union. She was the only one who really cared for it. The English only wanted it to solve the problem of the succession. The Scottish only wanted it when they'd been bribed large enough sum of money by the nobility, and they never really liked it. By the year 1713, people were thinking about dissolving it, but she was the one absolutely passionate advocate of the Act of Union. She was also the most conscientious monarch of the lot. No monarch, as a proportion of their time, attended more cabinet meetings or privy council meetings than Queen Anne. So she really, really swatted up and worked hard at it. And she cared passionately about the succession. And she knew that those Hanoverians were a bad bunch, and the Act of Settlement was about to lumber us with it. And she was constantly trying to lobby via third parties, her half-brother, James the Old Pretender, and saying, for God's sake, one communion, turn up once, pretend to be a Protestant, bluff like your uncle Charles II did throughout the whole of his reign, and you can be here, and we won't have to suffer this insufferable bunch of Germans. But alas, her very wise counsel wasn't taken.
What about the 20th century monarchs? I mean, obviously Elizabeth is from 52, 53 onwards. She is the main thing. But the Edwardian period. I mean, how do the rest of them rate?
Okay, I'll come to this in a second if I may do in just a second, because
sure.
She gets a special side chapter, if you like.
Okay.
I think Edward VII is extremely underrated. He gets to wait a long time to become king. It's relatively short reign, 9 years. It was quite surprising. His death was a surprise. It came out of nowhere, even though he was in the mid-60s, which was well above male life expectancy those times. But his mother treated him appallingly. She blamed him for the death of Prince Albert for a long while. She wouldn't allow him access to state papers until 1898. He was ascended in 1901.
Yeah. Now,
fortunately, there were back channels, not least Gladstone, by which stuff was shoved his way. But so his mother didn't behave very well. Edward himself was a gregarious character. He, again, in many ways, invented the concept of the media monarchy. in that when he was Prince of Wales and his mother was sort of in Windsor mourning all the time, not doing her job properly, he was the one who put his hand up and said, I'll go and open public buildings. So this notion of opening bridges or opening buildings or the rest of it actually dates from him as Prince of Wales, the notion of a sort of mover and shaker monarchy. Previous monarchs were far too grand to go around doing stuff like
opening a bridge, yeah, for goodness sake,
and running the risk of actually meeting people. I mean, you can't have that. But no, he created this sort of, he was fascinated by photography, which was then a very new medium. And he was very, very slick. He was kind of Taylor Swift of his generation, of working out how getting photographed in the right sort of places in the right sort of way boosted your image. And so he got away with the fact that, he shagged half of London and he engaged in illegal card schools. He got away with it because people kind of felt a warm glow that he was much more of a public monarch than was his mother. And when he became king, he was the oldest person to become king until Charles III. His gregariousness, he's a bit like Charles III in some ways, very, very fluent in both French and German, very good linguist, therefore a very good personal diplomat. The entente cordiale, Edward VII is not merely the icing on the cake, he's the cake.
Right.
He was really, really good at all that sort of stuff. He handled the controversy around the people's budget as well as could be done in 1909. In fact, you have two general elections, one of which comes after his own death, sadly. It is an interesting question of history about if he'd lived another 10 years, might the run-up to World War I have been more avoidable? Right. And he was also a great thinker on matters of military reform. He was a strong advocate of military change. So he's pulling a few levers. He looks like a jolly bloke with a beard who likes a drink. Yeah. But actually, he's pulling a few levers in the way of Victoria. Nobody would listen to her views on the military or anything else. Her opinions are generally useless. Partly because her mother had refused to allow her to be trained properly for the monarchy by William IV, because she disapproved of William IV, because before William IV became the heir apparent, he'd had 10 illegitimate children with an actress. So kind of, and Victoria's mother a bit of a prude like that. And didn't really
so when people say the monarchy isn't what it used to be, we should actually have a big sigh of relief then, if you can imagine someone not faking it.
Absolutely. No, there is nothing in the modern monarchy that you can't pop back a century or two and say, well, actually, that one was worse. And that one was wilder. And, Harry and Meghan, well, hang on, what about William and his actress with 10 kids on the side? Slammed up in Clarence Palace in order to keep them quiet. It was a rest of it. So anyway, I think Edward VII is the great underestimated one. George V, we can't sort of B-, but everyone agrees with that. Yeah. Edward VIII, no, thank you very much. George VI, handled
the way you said that, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, an absolute mercy in many ways. Mrs. Simpson came along. Well, we'd stuck with him as king for much longer. Elizabeth II, I think, is really interesting. And I've got a bespoke chapter on Elizabeth II. Yeah. Partly, obviously, because she died relatively recently at the time the book was written, but partly because I think she is very fairly rated as really good. Yeah. I mean, she's definitely in your top 10. But the point of the chapter that I write is she's really good for reasons that don't necessarily come to mind first. People underestimate how difficult her hand was in February 1952 when her father died. So she's quite young. The wars interrupted her training to be in monarchy. She's relatively recently married with young children. She hadn't expected her father to die. Yeah. You've still got an ex-king lurking out there in dear old Edward VIII, who a bit like some aging rock star, always believes that somehow he'll be called back to the stage, despite all the evidence that he won't. You've got what to do with her mother, the Queen Elizabeth, who had been used to, under George VI, in many ways a co-monarchy. Because of George's physical frailty, sure. Elizabeth was much more than just a consort. In ordinary circumstances, she would become the Dowager Queen. But Mary, the wife of the late Charles V, is still alive. So that title's been bagged. So they have to invent this whole notion of the Queen Mothership. Yeah. Even though actually she could have become Dowager Queen by the end of 1953, because Mary had by then died. But anyway, so you've got two ex-queens, one ex-king. You've got a husband who's very, very irritated about the fact that nobody will listen to him, and is more or less constantly being blocked by his mother-in-law, who was never that wild about the marriage anyway, and regards him as a sort of dangerous upstart of a reformer. So it's not an easy hand to begin with. And if you think of Elizabeth II's reign, she had a pretty good 50s, because she did quite well on her feet. 60s, I think there's some argument the royal family found adapting to swinging the 60s a bit tricksy.
Well, they did let the TV cameras, didn't they? They let the TV cameras, and there was the Prince of Wales, and the crowning of the Prince of Wales.
But if you now watch the royal family TV series, it's cringeworthy. I mean, it was just.
But it was drawing back the curtain, though, wasn't it, Tim? At the time, I mean, we'd never seen it.
It was, but that in a sense was a sign of weakness and defensiveness, that they felt that they were becoming irrelevant. So in order to demonstrate their relevance, they brought in the camera to show how irrelevant they were. So she had tricky 60s, 70s pretty reasonable. 80s very bouncy as Di enters the scene. 90s quite close to catastrophic.
Yeah.
I mean, they were very, very respectable historians. People like Norman Davies, who is my absolute favourite historian, because he writes big books about big sweeps of history, which rather than just sort of focusing on medieval carrots or whatever happens to be.
Don't knock your root vegetables. I mean, come on.
But Norman Davies,
as Edward II would say,
reflecting a consensus position in the late 90s, thought surely this monarchy thing will end with her. I mean, she'll be the last one, because we don't want to shove her out. That'd be rude. And she's a nice enough lady with a sense of duty. But surely this thing has got to Ruritania basis. But actually, Elizabeth II played such a blinder in the last 20 years of her life. It was just when she became the world's great grandmother, never mind Britain's, and just demonstrated such a quality of judgment those 20 years that she bought the monarchy another chance. She bought the chance for Charles III, to get on the throne, to be a little bit different to her, and then open it up for for William V and George VII thereafter. And that is why she should really be regarded as a highly rated monarch, because the fundamental problem of the British monarchy today, if I can elaborate, which is it doesn't actually fit in any one of the three buckets of world monarchies. So you either have absolute monarchies which are absolute monarchies, where they're genuinely in charge. Monarchies where they are symbolic in an almost sort of serene or godlike sense, so you get in Asia. So they're massively beyond politics or indeed life. They're sort of up there.
Floating beneficently. Yeah.
Or you have the so-called bicycling monarchs, the Nordics and Benelux, where they're sort of citizen monarchies.
Yeah.
And the British monarchy, up until this point, I suspect William will be the transition figure to something close akin to the bicycling monarchy, doesn't fit in any of those three buckets. It's got theoretically, it's got many of the powers of absolute monarchy. Laws can't be laws unless they sign it. It's head of a church, so in a sense, there's that kind of spiritual sereneness. And it kind of does walk about some public functions, but it's not actually landed solidly in that third camp yet. So,
but the one thing interesting to me, you said, we get, after Charles III, we get William what's going to be William VI? William V, and George the
Seventh.
Yeah, but
assuming that they stick with their own names.
Exactly, but not only that, but you assume that that's the succession plan. But as history teaches us one thing, things happen in the lives of monarchs. I mean, we could have Harry the Bleeding. Well, that would be.
You'd have to kill all off of William's children to get to Harry.
Some shellfish incident. You never know. Something going wrong somewhere. But if nothing else, that's what history teaches us.
I bet they're not all allowed to eat shellfish at the same time. Yeah, a bit like
King Louis the First. Can you see that one?
Oh, yeah. It'd be a bit act of reconciliation with our European neighbours, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
There've been a number of heirs to the throne who've had Louis sort of in their name, but normally as a middle name. But no, you're quite right, actually, in fairness to you, because if you did have Charles, the eldest first son, followed by William, the eldest first son, followed by George, the eldest first son, I think I'm right in saying That would be the first time in history that you've actually had that. That normally you either have a death somewhere, or a brother somewhere, or a coup, or a usurpation, or something, or obviously a queen.
Yes.
And that kind of takes that out. So it would be unusual. But on current expectations, should we go for William V and George VII?
Indeed. So just because we've only got 2 minutes, and I could probably speak until the end of George the whatever's reign at this point. But which monarch do you think then we should be looking at? Anne, or who should we be reappraising, Tim?
But my starting point is my starting point 20 odd years ago, that Henry VII, because he had a blood claim to the throne that was about as strong as you and mine. So he manages to establish a dynasty despite really a joke of a hand. I mean, he becomes the Lancastrian candidate because everyone else is dead, literally. Bosworth Field was a mother of all flukes. So he really shouldn't have been there very long. But he establishes a dynasty. He is so good with money that at the time he dies, he is literally the richest man in Europe. He runs a very astute foreign policy and diplomatic policy, particularly recognizing earlier than others the coming rise of Spain. And despite the sad death of his eldest son, Arthur, there is a healthy male heir in Henry and 2 daughters to marry off for dynastic reasons. So that's a pretty good performance.
The book is called Measuring Monarchy. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Tim, if people want to find you online, where's the best place to check in and say lovely things to you?
The lovely things, LinkedIn, because I'm there. Anything unpleasant, Facebook, because I'm not on it.
The book is called Measuring Monarchy. It's by Tim Hams, who's speaking today. Tim, as you can probably tell, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Okay, and a great pleasure to be interviewed by you, sir. Cheers.